Welcome. Glad you can make it. Ready to take down some notes? Whether they be mental notes or notes on a piece of paper, this is the first episode of BG, a series in which we go over the reading and writing of Chinese. But before we get to that, I want to go over an introduction, going over planning goals, which I feel is the most important step towards learning any language. Now, goals are something that people often neglect or forget about or don't put enough emphasis on, and I'm guilty of this as well. So, I want to make sure to spend at least one episode covering goals and how to make them. So, a bit of a quick overview. First thing we're going to do on this episode is learn how to create goals with some examples. Second thing is going over the specific goals of this series, what we'll try to be tackling and what we hope to accomplish by the end of the series. Third thing would be learning tips that I use to help me learn Mandarin. And fourth would be covering some of the resources that I use. Not all of them, but at least the most common ones that I use. In the future, I might bring up some more examples. Before we learn about Chinese, let's go over an English word, fluency. Now, you might say that you already know what it means, but have you really thought about what it means to be fluent in a language? I feel that this is a question that is under a lot of debates among language learners. So, Webster defines fluency as capable of using a language easily and accurately. So, some people might hear that and start questioning their own fluency for anybody who grew up bilingual or maybe trilingual. You might have tackle with this question of, do I really know my second or third language as well as I think I do? So here are some of my own definitions of fluency, what I consider to be fluency for myself. And again, your definition could vary, others' definitions would vary as well. But for speaking, it would be the ability to communicate with strangers even when they control the topic. Now, this is an important distinction to make. If you're like me and you watch polyglots on YouTube speaking to strangers, one thing you might notice is that oftentimes they'll take control of the conversation and choose the topic. Now, this is not to disparage them, but rather to show you the tricks of the trade, so to say, that if you take control of the conversation, it makes it much easier on you. But if you want to test your fluency, you would give up control to the person you're speaking to, let them choose a topic, see if you can follow along. That's how you really know if you're fluent in the language. For listening, it would be something like being able to watch a TV program or movie designed for the general audience, not a kids movie or TV show, which are designed to be simple to understand, but one meant for the general audience. Listening to it, being able to understand and summarize it. Now, for fluency, you don't have to understand 100% of the program or the movie, just the important part. Even if you understand just 80% of it, using context, you can guess what the other 20% is going to be. Now, writing and reading are going to be the main focus of this series, and they go hand in hand. Same way that speaking and listening go hand in hand, you can't really write without being able to read, and vice versa. Well, I suppose you can read without writing, but learning how to write definitely helps a lot with reading. Now, with writing and reading, the question of fluency, there's actually a number attached to it, 2,500 characters. That's the number I've heard for achieving fluency in writing and reading. If you can write and or read 2,500 characters in Chinese, then you can read a newspaper, you can write an essay, things like that. All right, now that we discussed fluency, let's go ahead and ask ourselves the question, do we really need it? Now, that might seem like a bit of a silly question, maybe a bit of an abrasive question, but really think about it. What is your goal? I feel like the reason a lot of people give up on learning languages is because they get a little too ambitious and set their expectations really high and attempt to attain fluency. But fluency is something that takes years, if not decades, to achieve, depending on how much time and effort you put into it. And a lot of language learners, they just don't have that much time. So we need to create more short-term goals. We need to set aside that fluency as a long-term goal, a really long-term goal. So let's take a look at some examples. Let's look at the short term, which is a couple weeks to a month, using my definition here. What can we accomplish in that time? Well, you can learn a set number of vocab words, right? Here I have listed 100. Maybe you can do that in 2 weeks. Maybe it'll take you the full month. Maybe you can learn 10 new vocab words a day. It's going to vary from person to person, and it's going to vary depending on what stage you're at in that language. When starting off, typically we learn a bunch of new words right away, and then it slows down until we hit a wall. But if you can break through that wall, perhaps you can go back to learning a bunch of vocab words in a short period of time. We could also try ordering food at a restaurant. That might take a while to learn, although I think most of the time will be spent on building up our confidence. Remember, you're still a language learner, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You can start ordering food even just a week after learning the language. If you make a lot of mistakes, that's fine. Like I said, native speakers can do a very good job of understanding what you're trying to say, even if you make a lot of mistakes. And we could say the same thing about introducing yourself to a native speaker. This is something you can do fairly quickly just by learning some greetings. So I would say probably learn a few more topics. Learn how to describe your hobbies, learn how to describe your favorite foods, learn how to describe your work, and learn how to ask those questions to the native speaker too. And you can practice your listening when you listen to their response. So, what can we do for the long term? This is going to be between a month to a year. And I would advise against putting fluency into this category. Really, you should go to the third category, the really long term goals, the ones that are a year plus. Unless you're already familiar with learning languages, there are those out there who can tout becoming fluent in a language in 6 months or less. But if this is your first time learning a new language, or if you feel that the Chinese language in particular is a little daunting, then maybe you can replace that first one, read and understand a newspaper, which I mentioned before was a sign of literacy. Maybe we can replace newspaper with a short story or a couple articles just to start off with. Next goal would be to watch an episode of a show with no subtitles. Now, at first, you might only understand 5% of it, and this could be really discouraging, but this is the process that any language learner goes through. We start off knowing very little, but then we watch it again and we increase our knowledge. We go from 5% to 10% to 15% until eventually you can understand the whole episode and summarize it. Lastly, we can graduate from having an introductory conversation to having an extended conversation, something like around 5 minutes of in depth discussion. And again, you could take control of the conversation, or you can give up control to the native speaker and really test yourself. So the goal that you choose is going to depend on which aspect you want to focus on. Do you want to learn the speaking, listening, reading, or writing, or any combination of those? It's all going to be up to you. With that said, let's discuss the goals of this series in particular. We're going to be focusing on reading and writing. Some of the short-term goals will be learning about radicals, which are the building blocks of Chinese characters. We're going to be learning about stroke order, which is a fundamental rule of Chinese writing. And we're going to be learning about pinyin, the pronunciation system of Chinese, particularly romanization for English learners. If you look around, you'll see some Chinese characters already. Take a moment to just familiarize yourself with them. The one in the middle is yong, and it means forever. The one in the lower left corner is shu, and it means to rest. And you'll see some numbers next to them. Those are the stroke orders. You can see how many strokes make up each of these characters. Yong has 5 strokes, and shu has 6. And the numbers tell you which ones to write first. On the right, you have right next to our mascot, Hanzi, you have the character Hanzi. This is the pinyin system I was discussing, mostly used to teach foreign speakers to speak Chinese. Native Chinese speakers use their own system, although some of them are familiar with pinyin as well. But now I want to shift your attention back to the long-term goals. We're going to be learning 1,000 of these Hanzi or Chinese characters, which might seem a lot, but again, that's why it's a long-term goal. Now, we're also going to attempt to read short stories, but before that, of course, we're going to practice with reading some Chinese characters and then eventually making phrases, then sentences, then paragraphs, and then we can tackle short stories. Again, it's a long-term goal, so it's going to take us a while to get there. I'm not 100% sure on writing short stories. I might make a video at that in the future, but I'll think about it. And the last long-term goal will be to eventually stop using pinyin. Again, I'm still considering that too, because that is a big step, but it is a very important step to eventually stop using pinyin, because native Chinese speakers, they don't use pinyin either, right? But again, it depends on whether or not your goal is to achieve fluency in the language. So depending on my audience and whether or not they're comfortable with that idea, whether or not we eventually get to that point, again, that's for us to figure out in the future. All right, so I discussed the important parts that I wanted to get through. I know it's been quite a while, so feel free to pause and take a break. But if you come back, I want to share with you some tips to help encourage you, some useful advice that's helped me. Some of these might be a little obvious, but they bear repeating. Tip number one, authentic material. Now, this does not mean avoiding non native speakers. After all, I'm a non native speaker. I feel like we have a lot of valuable insight and information. It just means that whatever material you get, make sure you get it from someone with a clear understanding of your specific target language. Chinese is an umbrella term for a lot of different languages, dialects, and even regional accents. And I'll discuss those further in a future episode so you can have a clear understanding of what exactly is you're trying to learn and then find target material in that specific language, in that specific accent if you can. It's a little difficult, but again, do your research. Make sure you get quality material, especially if you're going to spend money on it. I can say that for my own videos, I've been practicing this language for around 6 or 7 years, and I also have friends who are native speakers who I run this by to make sure that all my information is as accurate as I can make it. And in those 6 or 7 years, I think one thing I was really lacking was consistency. I've been practicing on and off for those years, so I haven't made as much progress as I would like. So my recommendation to you would be consistency. Just like if you were to exercise, you would want to do it daily so you make the most progress. Same thing with learning languages. 5 or 6 days a week, even as little as 15 minutes a day, so long as you keep it daily, you should see significant progress. Some people even claim 10 or 5 minutes. I'm not too sure about that, but again, consistency is the key word. All right, next one, mnemonic device. What is that? Well, if you're asking yourself that question, then it means you haven't seen my other video, but no worries, I'll explain it now. If you look up online, a mnemonic device would be any learning technique that aids information retention or retrieval in the human memory. Let me give you an example. Have you ever wondered how some people are really good at memorizing random numbers or letters? Let's say a Wi-Fi password, right? One method is to use anagrams. You take those random letters or numbers and you create a sentence out of them. You might have done this in school with the orders of operation or PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Maybe done this to remember the planets. My very educated mother just served us noodles, is how we remember Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. If this is all new to you, I highly recommend this system to help you with your memorization. It's what I use to help me remember things like Wi-Fi passwords, license plates, and even Chinese. So what I do with Chinese is I take a Chinese character, and typically they're made of many different radicals, and these radicals tend to have meaning. However, the meaning isn't always related to the character at large. So I create little stories for each of these characters to help me remember how to write it, to remember the radicals that go into it. And I can discuss that further in a future episode. And you're probably sick and tired of listening to me talk about future episodes, but I do appreciate you staying and listening to what I had to say. I feel like there's a lot of good information here for beginners. For those of you who already know a little bit about Chinese, already know what you're doing, feel free to jump to a future episode. You probably already have, but just in case you decided to still stick around, again, I appreciate it greatly. But all right, moving on. I'll be going through these next points a little quickly since they are kind of obvious, but they bear repeating. But take down lots of notes, especially if you can put it on paper. The action of taking down notes helps the material stick in your head, helps you memorize, especially with mnemonic devices. Don't forget to challenge yourself. One issue that a lot of language learners have is that they feel that they plateau. They feel like they don't make a lot of progress. And a lot of times that could be because we get ourselves into a sort of comfort zone. We only review the words that we already know, or we already watch shows that we've seen before, and we kind of get a little lazy and complacent. Part of the reason we don't challenge ourselves might be because of the fear of making mistakes. This is something that you're going to run into quite a lot, especially with speaking, and it happens to me as well. But again, challenge yourself, get over that fear, and experiment. That's really important process, especially again with speaking. Every time you learn a new vocabulary word, try using it in a new sentence, try creating new sentences. Of course, you're going to make mistakes. And this is primarily going to be for those who have a native speaker as a tutor or a friend to help correct them. If you don't, stick around. I'll give you some advice. But The last point that I want to make here is to have fun. I'm going to assume that many of the people watching my videos are learning languages for fun. If you're learning it because of work or some obligation, you probably already have set aside some goals. You probably already have gone through this process already. But for those of you learning for fun, try and keep it that way. There are going to be moments where you start losing interest, moments where you feel frustrated, and in those instances, just move on to something else. Experiment with new methods of learning, try new materials, try challenge yourself. Just try and keep having fun, right? All right, we're in the final stretch here. And if you feel like it's going on for too long, well, that's what language learning is like. It takes a while to. And don't worry, future episodes, I'll try to keep it shorter than this. I just have a lot to get through. And with that said, I also want to share my resources with you. Let's go over some apps that you can download on your phone. You're going to want a dictionary. There's a ton out there. The one that I use is Pleco. It has a free version and a paid version. I find that the free version has basically everything that I need. Ton of definitions for each word. It has Mandarin and Cantonese definitions. It has a bookmark system to save some of your favorite words. It has a flashcard system as well. But go ahead and experiment with a bunch of different dictionaries and see which one works best for you. For flashcards, I use a separate app called Daily Chinese. The way it works is you choose a topic, and in that topic, there's a set list of vocabulary words. Every day, you're introduced to a certain number of new vocabulary words. You can choose how many. I've chosen 5. So it gives me 5 new vocabulary words for me to study and memorize. And the next day, it gives me 5 new vocabulary words, plus it tests my knowledge of the previous vocab words that I went through. And every day you log in, you test yourself, and you see how many new vocabulary words you can accumulate, and it keeps track of the ones that you've remembered successfully. There's a ton of flashcard apps out there, so again, go ahead and experiment, try some out. Anki is another one that I've heard people recommend, but the one that I use is Daily Chinese, and that's worked for me so far. But again, don't be afraid to challenge yourself and try new things, right? These are just a couple recommendations. All right, next one, language class or language exchange. Now, this is going to be really vital for taking your language learning to the next level. As a beginner, you can hold off on this. You don't need to use these when starting off, but eventually you will need to practice with a native speaker, either a friend or by hiring a tutor on websites like italki, or going to your local college and signing up for a course, maybe joining a program that can get you a certification. But if you don't have any native speaking friends, or if you don't have the money to afford this, don't worry, there is an option for you. It's called language exchange. What you do is, instead of paying someone to teach you a language, you teach them a language. So let's say you speak English and you want to learn Mandarin. There's a lot of people out there who speak Mandarin and want to learn English. So you spend 1 hour teaching them, and they spend 1 hour teaching you. That's how language exchange works. There's a ton of resources out there for language exchange, but I'll give you one that I found some success with. Hello Talk. I was able to find a couple language exchange partners on there, but again, there's a ton of places you can go to visit, or you could go to your local libraries perhaps. Maybe they have a program. Just look around and really take this opportunity to make some new friends, right? All right, last few resources. I want to discuss shows, movies, and podcasts. Now, there's a ton to wade through, but I'll give you a couple of examples just to get you started. You can start off with kids shows. These are designed for beginner language learners, obviously, and the language that they use is not going to be everyday vocabulary words. It's going to be very basic, but you'd be surprised at how difficult it could be to comprehend and understand even a kid show in a different language. But with repeated viewings, you should be able to get the hang of it. So you should start recognizing patterns, um, recognizing vocabulary words, and then when you feel confident, you can move on to maybe podcasts. One podcast I'll recommend, and actually a lot of people recommend this one, it's Chinese Pod. It's a podcast that offers beginner and intermediate levels. I think perhaps they offer an advanced level as well. I'm using the intermediate level currently, and they cover more everyday conversation, like going out to dinner, asking for directions, more practical vocabulary and sentences, uh, compared to the kids shows that you'll be starting off with, right? One more piece of advice that I'll give you is to rewatch a movie or show that you've seen in English, but this time watch it in the dub of your target language. And again, try to find authentic material. Try to make sure that it's a good quality dub. I think nowadays it's easier than ever to find good quality dubs of your favorite shows or movies. Now, what this does is it removes the confusion of not knowing what's happening or what's going on because you don't understand the language. Since you already seen the movie or the program, you know what's going to happen, you know what the characters are going to say. So now you can see what they're going to say in your target language. It gives you a little more confidence, right? It gives you a better understanding of how the language works. And with that, we'll end the episode. There is more that I wanted to cover, but I'll put it as a part two, and we'll discuss the decisions that we make when choosing a Chinese language. And after that, we'll finally get into reading and writing Chinese. Until then, I'll see you next time. Zai Zhen.